Good afternoon. Julian Vasquez Heilig. I'm a professor of Ed Leadership and Policy Studies at California State, Sacramento. I also serve as the Education Chair for the California NAACP. So I would like to talk a little bit about the global, the choice, civil rights, and community self-determination. And based on some of the conversations that I've had here at this international conference on school choice and education reform, I guess I'm a little bit of a skunk in the garden party. The United States has not yet realized the 1954 mandate of Brown versus Board to address segregation and deep-seated inequality in the United States. Today, more than 60 years later, schools across the United States are profoundly separate and unequal based on race and class. As these papers demonstrate, our failure extends to disparities across the spectrum of education, including law, performance, access to school boards, and how school discipline is administered. It's a national shame that the state-sanctioned sabotage of human potential is readily apparent in communities in Louisiana, Tennessee, Michigan, and other states across the United States. As these papers demonstrate, these issues are being amplified, in fact made worse, by the school privatization and private control movement, which many civil rights organizations have called the illusion of school choice. The NAACP and other community-based activists have called upon the education reformers to refocus on inequality instead of privatization and private management and the private control of education. We are seeking to move the discourse concretely from choice to equity. Dutu Brown, National Director of the Journey for Justice Alliance, has talked about this problem in Chicago and asked the following questions. It really brings it home. Why does one school have debate teams, robotics, clubs, socio-emotional support, and others do not? Why does one child have the opportunity to learn a foreign language and others do not? And he speaks from his community. Separate and unequal education is about access to resources and opportunity, not whether large numbers of schools are available. We must stand firm on the equity issue, critique structural and institutional racism, and advocate for the rights of families to be treated with dignity and provided educational opportunity. Organizing efforts to focus on community-driven reform and equity instead of choice and privatization are growing. The platform promoted by the NAACP, the Movement for Black Lives, and the We Choose Coalition includes a moratorium on school privatization. Community advocates are also advocating for sustainable community schools, an end to zero tolerance policies, a national equity assessment of public education in the United States, stopping the attacks on teachers of color, which occurred in New Orleans as hundreds of teachers of color were fired as the education reformers moved in, appointed school boards, mayoral control, and finally, a limit on the continued over-reliance on standardized tests. Community advocates are solution-oriented, as they are organizing to advance a progressive public education agenda in cities across the United States to inform and build momentum for a national consensus to end privatization and private control. Both the NAACP and other civil rights organizations such as the Journey for Justice Coalition have launched a series of conversations and town halls in cities across the United States to listen to communities and understand their impact of school privatization and private control. The modern civil rights movement is also successfully engaging people in social media and in person on the ground and undertaking critical conversations about privatization and private control of public education. Community stakeholders across the United States have won sustainable community schools as one alternative, but they're seeking to stop school closings, are supporting progressive school board members, leading a revolt against testing, and organizing boycotts and hunger strikes to pressure and to stop policymakers from closing schools. The NAACP and other community-based organizations continue to organize in cities across the United States to build the political will to advance a community-based education reform agenda. Indeed, while our schools have many successes, public education still needs improvement, especially to remedy the severe inequalities that we've talked about. 60 years after Brown versus Board, education is still very separate and unequal, despite decades of school choice policies and education privatization. Wealthier students still have priority access to ideal educational environments. Black and brown communities are still being denied those same opportunities, and in many cities bear the onus of improving, quote unquote, failing schools. But there's hope for change. Hope remains in empowerment and self-determination, in creating coalitions, in the ability to organize communities of educators and other public education stakeholders around the problems that school choice have introduced and even accelerated. We have liberty to advocate for community-based education for students rather than private control